Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek McCush. Every year, about 11,000 people who work in farming in India are listed as having killed themselves. The actual number is probably much higher, and in recent years the number of suicides is increasing. High levels of debt, the impacts of climate change, and government policy are all factors in the despair of small-scale farmers. In this episode of Human Rights Magazine, Aditya Sathe explores the reasons behind the poverty of India's farmers and possible solutions.
A couple years ago, in 2020, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi passed the farm bills in hopes of regulating supply in the agriculture industry. These bills were made up of three main sections: essential commodities, trade, and price assurance. These laws defined what it means for a good to be an essential commodity and set rules about how much of these goods can be stored by suppliers and at what prices. They also wanted to privatize agricultural trade and let companies farm through private contracts. While the bills were intended to boost production and trade of farm produce to everyone, some farmers worried that markets might hoard the produce and drive up prices. Hence, farmers took to the streets to protest, and successful it was, as the bills were eventually repealed. However, these protests were not a result of immediate reaction towards the bills, but more of long-time neglect and frustrations piling up within the farming community of India. To understand more about the long-term causes that have been in play regarding this issue, I spoke with Mr. Devinder Sharma, an expert in agricultural policy and long-time advocate for human rights to be addressed in Indian agriculture. I first asked him to talk about why the bills negatively impacted the farmers and what were the short-term factors which led to the protest. This is how our conversation went.
Well, I think we must understand that the farmers' protest, the iconic farmers' protest that happened in 2020-21, was an outcome of the severe distress that prevails in agriculture, and I think the farmers took it upon themselves to stand up for their own rights or to draw the attention of the policymakers and so on, that agriculture was in the throes of a severe distress. And for all these years, the academia, the media, the policymakers, the state assemblies or the parliament had not been able to deliver what was or could be a solution to address the farm crisis that, as I said, was prevailing in this country for so long. And so eventually they took it on to the streets themselves. And that is what the world has seen in the form of a year-long protest by farmers at that time in 2021. And now again, farmers have been protesting since the month of February in Punjab, adjoining to the borders of Haryana, because they wanted to, undertake a march to Delhi to show that the crisis or the solution to that crisis, which many believe is the guaranteed prices being paid to farmers, has not been, or no attempt is being made to address that. I think what we miss out is the emphasis is on increasing and productivity, and it has not been accompanied by an effort to see that the farmer's livelihood is also taken care of. So, which means basically agriculture is suffering from a livelihood issue, and somehow, as I said earlier, policymakers and academia have not been able to see through that why are farmers agitated. I think before we try to understand what will happen now, given the new political situation, I think more important it is to understand what exactly is the crisis. If I can draw your attention to that, so that we know why is that crisis so severe. That farmers are left with no choice but to take on as far as take on or step into the streets themselves. Let's be very clear that in 2016, I remember when the government announced that they will be doubling farmers' income in the next 5 years. The economic survey, which, as you know, is a government's document, which is released 2 days before the budget is presented in Parliament. That economic survey 2016 had said that the average income of a farming family in 17 states of India, which roughly means half the country, and the average income they had worked out was rupees 20,000 per year, which means less than 1,700 rupees per month. Now, in 1,700 rupees per month, I can't even rear a cow. So imagine how the families were surviving in at least half the country. Then another survey comes out in 2021 that is based on the situational assessment survey of agriculture households done in 2019. And it tells us that the average income of a agriculture household in this country is 10,218 rupees per month. Now, 10,218 rupees per month would mean that the average income from agriculture alone is low, because this is including the non-farm activities, the income from non-farm activities, that the average comes to 10,218 rupees. But there were studies which showed us that if you just look into the income from agriculture alone, and no farm, no non-farm activity, only agriculture, then it comes to 27 rupees per day. Now, at this paltry income in agriculture, how do you expect farmers to survive?
As Mr. Sharma ended on a thought-provoking rhetorical question, I attempted to dig deeper into exactly why this problem has persisted. So to follow up, I asked Mr. Sharma if there were any long-term implications to the issue. For background understanding, I will explain the context. In 1991, India had begun to pile up severe debt and found it difficult to balance payments. Trade had slowed, and borrowing was becoming harder to finance. As a result, policymakers decided to liberalize the Indian economy and boost growth in industry. From here, Mr. Sharma will explain how it connects to the farmers' issue.
Well, I have always said that if you really want to understand what is going wrong with agriculture, you must try to get a grip over the economic design that the world follows. The economic design has been pushing farmers out of agriculture, and we are made to believe that if there are more people in agriculture, there will be less economic growth. I think this fundamentally flawed and outdated economic thinking has to change. When 1991 India brought in the economic reforms, I think our policymakers did commit a mistake. It was very easy to cut and paste from the Western countries or to the Western ideology and come up with a kind of a reform process, basically, which focused on industry as the engine of growth. I think Indian policymakers failed to see or acknowledge that in India, given even at that time in 1991, there were more than 60% population involved with agriculture or dependent on agriculture. The focus of the policymakers at that time should have been, or of the policies that they were trying to reform, should have been that besides the industry, they had treated agriculture as the second engine of growth. Our policymakers failed at that time to visualize this or to see this. I thought for any country where 50% population is engaged with agriculture or engaged in agriculture, policymakers couldn't have turned a blind eye. But in 1991, yes, they did. And that is what we are suffering from even today.
Speaking about Western countries, Mr. Sharma followed up his points with some comparisons to the situation of agriculture in other countries, both historically and today.
If you look at the United States of America, just to illustrate, in 1970s, when Richard Nixon was the prime minister, was the president of America, roughly about 15% of Americans were engaged in agriculture. Today, that number has come down to 1.5%. And yet, agriculture in America is devastated. The rate of suicide in rural America is 3.5 times the national average. And barring a couple of years when America is able to find export avenues for its agriculture, agriculture has been facing with declining incomes in America. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that failed, agriculture could not be a kind of a lesson for a country like India. And agriculture not only in America. Look at European Union. And we recently, in the early part of this year, saw massive farmers' protests across at least 24 countries of European Union. And among those points that the farmers were trying to flag off. One, of course, was they wanted guaranteed income for their produce. The American farmers too had wanted guaranteed income for their produce and what they call as income parity. This was demanded by farmers' protests that happened in America when Jimmy Carter was the president, and I talk of 1979 era when hundreds and thousands of tractors had marched into Washington D.C., stayed there for some months or some weeks, and they were demanding what? Income parity for farmers. This is exactly what the Indian farmers have been demanding in 2020-21. They want guaranteed price for their produce. So I think we need to understand that the economic design that the world follows is basically behind the demise of agriculture that we see everywhere.
However, there are indeed some other perspectives on this entire issue. To delve deeper into other takes, I spoke with Dr. Nilanjan Banik, who is a professor of economics and an expert in econometric analysis. To begin, I asked him for his thoughts on why farmers are currently protesting and what persistent institutions have been in place causing this issue to continue on long term.
So this has nothing to do with the farmers in general, because if you look into the overall classification of farmers, they are classified into three group. One is the small farmers with less than 1.5 hectare of landholding size. Then you have the mid-sized farmers with less than 5 hectare of landholding size. And then you have the big farmers with more than 10 hectares of landholding size. Now, if you see the proportion of farmers, the farming community in this broad classification, 83% of the farmers, 83% out of 100% are actually belongs to the category of small and marginal farmers. Okay. And the remaining less than 5% are the ones who are considered to be the big farmers. Now, if you look into the per capita income, and I wrote an article on that, of all the farmers across various states in India, it so happened that the farmers in Haryana and Punjab, these are the most richer group of farmers, farming communities. And who are the people who are actually protesting? It is the farmers from these two states predominantly. More than farmers, what I gather is it's a middleman, who are in the business of procuring the food grains, and then try to sell it to the retailers. Now, there are two aspects. One is they are demanding for the higher minimum support price. Now, farmers in Punjab and Haryana, they're anyway getting minimum support price. But what they are demanding this time is trying to ensure that this is legalized, that there should be a legal document from the government suggesting that this minimum support price is mandatory, in the sense that the government has to procure it, because many times what happens is even the government is notifying it, they may not implement or act on it, because it's not a legal document. So the farmers in these two states, they were demanding that this MSP should be legalized. Now, why is it that? Because what is happening again is you see that the government, fully knowing that the water table in these two states are falling, they wanted to move away from this water guzzling crops like rice and wheat, and because of that, they wanted to ensure that whether there is a possibility to incentivize the farmers to grow other types of crops, which may maybe require less water than what is needed for wheat, rice, and sugarcane. So that is the objective function of the government, and the government also want to move away from this whole business of procuring and distributing. You have the public distribution system. Both are costly affairs. So the government want to move outside this system of procuring as well as distributing. And the farmers in these two states are fearing that if that be the case, they might not get even the price which is guaranteed by the MSP. Because if the government move out, and they allow this big private corporate sectors like ITC or Adani or Reliance in the business of procurement. First of all, the negotiating power of the farmers comes down. Mind you, I'm talking about the big farmers as well as the middleman, because then you are actually seeing a scenario where you are pitching this group of individuals against the big corporate houses, which may arm twist them and trying to take their produce at a much cheaper price. So that is that is the reason, the primary reason why the farmers were protesting. So in 1991, when the reform started, it was like close to 26%. Right now, it is less than 14%. So in terms of the overall pie, although the economy is doing great, but the contribution of agriculture and people living on or earning their livelihood from the agriculture, nothing much has changed, which also explains why you have this whole notion of income inequality cropping up in India. As the economy grows, this is the standard Lewis model, right? You'll have to move from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services. For India, it's the other thing that we move from agriculture to services, bypassing the manufacturing. Now, what the government has realized that you will also have to build in the manufacturing. Okay, so because of that, you'll have to give some time, because once you start a process, the impact of that process, in this case, I'm talking about all this Make in India program or Atmanirbhar Bharat, at least few years to yield result and we are seeing some green shoot. If you look into the pharmaceutical as well as the electronic component export, that has started to increase, which is also kind of saying that the government incentive is working for propping up the manufacturing sector. So yeah, so that's a good news. But by what time it's going to happen, no one knows. It's happening. That's all I can tell you.
From here we can see the other perspective of the issue, that the economy naturally progresses from agriculture to manufacturing as technology progresses, and so in order to grow, the government incentivized labor to move into the big cities and work in areas such as manufacturing, textiles, and construction. After presenting these two different takes, it is important to understand what each side thinks the government should do to appropriately ensure human rights in agriculture is preserved. So I asked Mr. Sharma and Dr. Banik the same. What follows is their responses respectively.
My thinking is that we must broadly, let's say, one or two or three things that we need to do should focus on ensuring that it is time now for farmers to be given a guaranteed price for their produce. This I always say is because we have all, or the educated, I would say, or the educated elite have failed to understand and appreciate why is it that every industrial product which comes into the market comes with a price tag. If you buy a pen, it has a price. If you buy medicine, it has a price. If you buy a watch, it has a price. If you buy a motorcycle, it has a price. If you buy a car, it has a price. Why is it that it's only agriculture produce which does not have a price tag? Why is it that the farmers have to throw their tomato, potato, or the vegetables onto the streets? Why? Because there is no guaranteed price for them. So this was done deliberately by our economic masters, because to let the industry exploit agriculture, they ensured that there is no price tag on farm produce. And that is what the farmers are suffering.
And here is Dr. Banik.
Indian government is also doing lots of capital expenditure in terms of building roads, sports infrastructure, which also required not so high skill type of labors. So there you can also see some of the agricultural laborers finding some meaningful jobs. So in that way, I think it is going to be a natural progression in terms of excess agricultural laborers who are otherwise low productive workers getting absorbed either in the construction sector or in the government driven capital expenditure related projects that we see happening right now. See, we chose a path of service-driven economy, where unlike China, where it was driven by the manufacturing sectors. Now, after realizing that you also need to develop manufacturing sector, all this programs such as Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, production-linked incentive scheme, all these things have started happening. But this all started happening post 2014, after this NDA government came into power. Now, you'll have to give some time because otherwise, so historically, the services sectors were not able to absorb this low skill type agricultural labors. So that's the reason why you see this dichotomy between India versus Bharat. So hopefully that now with the incentives that the government is doing in terms of propping up manufacturing as well as the capital expenditure that I just now mentioned. Of course, in the meanwhile, the some of the states like West Bengal in particular, they did some land reform program where they tried to take away from land from the zamindar and try to distribute them to the what we call as the laborers working in that agricultural land, So there was things like crop sharing and stuff like that, which has actually led to increase in agricultural productivity. So in terms of economics, I think few of the states government has done that land reforms program that what I am just now mentioning. And that started way back in 1970s, late 1969 and until the late 1970s. So that has led to some distribution of land holding from the big farmers. But those things are kind of concentrated in few states like West Bengal, as I mentioned, but not equally developed in other states. So, yeah.
So, with all things considered, I asked my guests to make one final statement they felt was most apt for the current situation involving human rights in Indian agriculture and how to progress forward with policy and change. Their statements sum up their takes on the issue very well.
I think G20 countries' leadership should take up this particular issue, reframe the economic education system, which means start with economics 101 and then, of course, look into the economic design that has been laid before us and why there's a need to change.
I don't think there is no issues related to human rights. The only thing which has to do with the system is how to ensure that people are organically moved from the agriculture to non-agricultural activities. And I think the process has started. So sooner you're going to see this result.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.